Every few months, a headline makes the rounds. A new country announces it's done with the US dollar. A summit is held. Bold statements are made. And financial commentators on both sides of the argument go into a frenzy either adjust, proclaiming the end of American dominance, or laughing the whole thing off as empty rhetoric. But here's the question nobody actually answers in those breathless articles. What really happens when a country sits down and tries to stop using the dollar? Not in theory, in practice. What are the real mechanics? What breaks? What works? And who has actually come close? Because the story of de-dollarisation is not a story of simple geopolitical will. It's a story of infrastructure, fear, inertia, and the brutal complexity of rewiring a global financial system that has been building for 80 years. Let's get into it. To understand why ditching the dollar is so hard, you first have to understand why it became dominant in the first place, and it wasn't inevitable. In 1944, as World War II was winding down, representatives from 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They had a problem. International trade had collapsed during the interwar years, partly because countries were all trying to maintain their own monetary systems and nobody trusted anybody else's currency. They needed a new framework. A deal they struck was elegant and brutal at the same time. Every currency would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. One anchor for the whole system. The US, having emerged from the war as the world's dominant industrial power, with most of its gold reserves intact, was the only country that could credibly make this offer. But the dollar's role didn't stop when that system collapsed in 1971, when Nixon famously took the U.S. off the gold standard. By then, something more powerful than a treaty was holding the dollar in place. Habit, infrastructure, and oil. In the early 1970s, a quiet diplomatic arrangement was made between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The kingdom would price its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. Other OPEC nations followed. Suddenly, any country in the world that needed to buy oil, which meant virtually every country in the world needed to hold US dollars. Not to trade with America specifically, just to buy energy. That single structural fact created an enormous, persistent global demand for dollars. Countries started holding dollar reserves not just as a store of value, but as a functional necessity. And when you hold reserves in a currency, you naturally price your own exports in that currency. You borrow in it. You sign contracts in it. The network effects compound. Today, roughly 54% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars. Around 42% of international transactions are settled in dollars. Approximately 60% of global trade invoicing uses dollars, even when the United States isn't one of the parties in the transaction. A Vietnamese manufacturer selling goods to a Turkish buyer will very likely write the invoice in dollars and settle in dollars, because both banks and both accounting systems are built around it. That is the wall any country trying to de-dollarize must climb. It's not just a political wall. It's a wall of infrastructure, incentive, and accumulated habit. Now let's talk about what actually happens when a country makes a serious attempt. The first pattern you notice is that de-dollarisation attempts are almost always triggered by sanctions, not ideologies. Countries don't generally wake up and decide to stop using dollars out of some abstract geopolitical principle. They get cut off, and then they scramble. Iran has been under U.S. sanctions in various forms since 1979, with the most severe packages hitting in the 2000 after the nuclear standoff. Being cut off from dollar-denominated systems didn't just mean Iran couldn't trade with America. It meant Iran struggled to trade with anyone because the pipes of global finance run in dollars. Iran's response was a patchwork of workarounds. It started conducting bilateral trade in euros, yuan, and local currencies wherever possible. It developed its own domestic interbank messaging system after being cut off from SWIFT. SOUT, the global financial messaging network that underpins most international transfers. It routed transactions through intermediary countries. It accepted gold in some deals. Did it work? Partially. Iran found ways to continue selling oil to China primarily, at heavy discounts and to keep some trade flowing. But the friction cost was enormous. The discounts Iran was forced to offer on its energy exports cost it hundreds of billions of dollars in lost revenue over the years. The alternative payment systems were slow, unreliable, and limited in scale. The Iranian economy contracted sharply during the peak sanction years. The lesson from Iran is that you can partially survive outside the dollar system, but you pay a severe economic penalty for doing so. And the alternatives available to you are thin. Russia offers a more recent and more dramatic case study. After the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the subsequent Western sanctions package, the most sweeping ever imposed, made on a majors and Tandarin around $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, held in European and American financial institutions, were frozen. Dollar transactions were cut off. Russia's response was significant. Trade with China surged, and bilateral settlements increasingly happened in yuan and rubles. Russia redirected energy exports to non-Western buyers. It moved to demand payment in rubles for gas sales to certain markets. It deepened its use of China's alternative payment messaging system known as SIPS as a partial SWIFT replacement. But here's where it gets interesting. Even after all of this, the ruble collapsed dramatically in the early weeks of the conflict before partially stabilizing. The Russian economy did contract. Consumer imports dried up in categories that depended on Western supply chains. And while Russia found alternative buyers for its energy, those buyers, China especially, negotiated from a position of enormous leverage, getting Russian resources at steep discounts. Russia survived economically, partially because its energy revenues remained substantial and partially because China provided a lifeline. But surviving is not the same as thriving outside the dollar system. Russia's economy remains structurally constrained by its isolation from dollar-denominated financial markets. Then there are countries that didn't even get kicked out. They abandoned the dollar by default because their own currencies collapsed so catastrophically that their own citizens started using dollars informally. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Argentina. In each of these cases, the dollar didn't impose itself through sanctions or geopolitics. It crept back in through the back door because people simply didn't trust their own government's currency. Mudansroik? That's a different kind of de-dollarisation failure, but it tells you something important. The dollar's dominance isn't purely structural. It's also a trust story. The most ambitious coordinated attempt at de-dollarisation in recent history is the BRICS project. And it deserves its own examination. BRICS, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has expanded in recent years to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, and Egypt, with more countries in various stages of membership discussions. At the 2023 summit in South Africa, talk of a common BRICS currency or a gold-backed alternative settlement system was rife. The financial media treated it as either the beginning of the end for the dollar or a diplomatic fantasy. The truth is more complicated than either. Here's what BRICS has actually built. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai, provides development finance to member countries in alternatives to the dollar, primarily in local currencies and yuan. It's a real institution with real capital. The contingent reserve arrangement provides a pool of foreign exchange reserves member countries can draw on in crisis. In crisis, reducing their dependence on the IMF, which operates predominantly in dollars. And intra-BRICS trade in local currencies has grown meaningfully, particularly between China and its trading partners. China has been systematically building the infrastructure for UN internationalization cross-border interbank payment systems. Currency swap agreements with over 40 central banks, and yuan-denominated oil contracts on the Shanghai Hang exchange, often called the petroyuan. But here is the structural problem with the BRICS vision of a common alternative currency. The member countries don't actually trust each other. India and China have a disputed border and competing regional ambings. Brazil's government changes ideological direction with each election. Russia is currently sanctioned by half the world. Saudi Arabia and Iran only recently re-established diplomatic relations. These countries agree on one thing: they resent American financial leverage, but resentment of a common adversary is not the same. As the deep institutional trust required to share a currency. When Europe created the euro, it took decades of economic integration, convergence requirements, a shared legal framework, and crucially a common security umbrella. Even then, the euro nearly collapsed during the debt crisis of 2010 to 2015 because the underlying fiscal and political divergences too great. BRICS is trying to achieve something similar among countries that have none of that institutional groundwork in a fraction of the time, while under active geopolitical pressure. UN itself faces a deeper limitation. For a currency to be truly global, foreign holders need to be able to do things with it. They need liquid, deep, accessible financial markets. They need the ability to invest freely, repatriate capital freely, and hold assets with confidence that they won't be arbitrarily seized or restricted. China's capital controls. Its restrictions on moving money in and out of the country make the yuan structurally unsuitable as a global reserve currency at this stage. Beijing wants the yuan to be used in trade. It does not want the full capital account liberalization that would be required for the yuan to replace the dollar in reserves. And worse, because that openness would mean losing control over its own financial system. BRICS de-dollarisation is real at the margins, but a wholesale replacement? Not in any near-term horizon. Here's the layer of the problem that almost no mainstream discussion covers. The dollar's dominance isn't just financial. It's embedded in physical and digital infrastructure. SWIFT, the messaging system that banks use to communicate about cross-border transfers, is headquartered in Belgium, but operates under significant American legal and political influence. When the U.S. pushed for Russia's removal, it happened swiftly, literally and figuratively, because the U.S. had already demonstrated with Iran that it could and would SWIFT access as a foreign policy tool. Alternatives exist. Russia's SPFS and China's CIPS are the main ones. But SPFS has very limited international reach, primarily Russian banks and a handful of willing counterparties. CIPS is more serious, processing trillions of yuan in annual settlements. But it still routes many transactions through SWIFT T-connected correspondent banks for the final leg, which means it doesn't fully circumvent American oversight. Beyond payments messaging, the dollar's reach extends into commodity pricing. Oil, gas, metals, agricultural futures, nearly all major commodity benchmarks are quoted and settled in dollars. Changing that requires creating new exchanges, convincing market participants to price and hedge in different currencies, and building the liquidity needed for those markets to be credible. China's yuan-denominated oil futures contract on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched in 2018. It has grown, but still represents a small fraction of global oil trading volume. Liquidity begets liquidity, and the dollar-denominated markets have an 80-year head start. There's also the legal layers. International commercial contracts, especially for large transactions, are typically governed by English or New York law, settled in London or New York courts. Switching contract law jurisdictions requires renegotiating legal standards that took generations to build and that counterparties trust precisely because they are established. Replacing them with Chinese or Russian legal jurisdictions, however technically feasible, asks counterparties to accept a political risk they can currently avoid. So is there a path where de-dollarisation actually succeeds, at least partially? Yes, and it looks like this. The most plausible near-term scenario isn't a single alternative reserve currency. It's a more fragmented, multipolar currency system where dollars remain dominant globally but yuan, euros, and perhaps a BRICS settlement unit handle a growing share of regional trade. Some analysts call this dollar globalization not a collapse, but a gradual dilution. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are the other wild card. China's digital yuan, the ECNY, is already operational domestically. China and several other central banks are running experiments in cross-border CBDC settlement that would, by design, bypass the dollar-denominated correspondent banking system entirely. The Bank for International Settlements is coordinating several of these experiments under Project M-Bridge. If multi-currency CBDC settlement scales up, it could give countries a genuinely usable tool for bypassing dollar infrastructure in bilateral trade, without needing to solve the reserve currency question at all. A deeper shift may be in energy. If the global energy mix transitions meaningfully away from oil toward electricity, the petrodollar's foundational logic weakens. Countries that needed dollars to buy oil may not need them in the same way to buy electrons generated locally from solar and wind. Truno. This is a long-run structural shift, unfolding over decades, but it's the kind of change that would undermine the dollar's position in a way that no political summit or alternative payment system and replicate in the short run. Countries that have tried to stop using the dollar, whether forced out by sanctions or driven by geopolitical ambition, have found that the PR object is far harder than the rhetoric suggests. Iran paid an enormous price in economic penalties. Russia survived through Chinese dependence and resource discounts. BRICS has built real alternative infrastructure at the margins, but faces fundamental political and structural constraints that prevent a wholesale challenge to dollar hegemony. What the evidence actually shows is that the dollar's dominance is not held in place by American military power alone or by some conspiracy of bankers. It's held in place by 80 years of accumulated trust, legal infrastructure, network effects, and critically the fact that no alternative has yet managed to offer the combination of liquidity, openness, legal predictability, and scale that the dollar provides. That doesn't mean it will always be this way. Empires of finance, like all empires, eventually give way to something new. But they tend to do so over generations, not decades, and usually only when the incumbent makes catastrophic mistakes. Ask Yamble whether the United States is making those mistakes right now with its weaponization of the dollar system. What's its political polarization, its fiscal trajectory, is a question we'll dig into in a future video. If you found this useful, hit subscribe and leave a comment below with the topic you want covered next. There's a lot more to unpack.